Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with the story, Hallowed Ground Part 3, penned by the twisted mind of the Vesper's Bell. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fear fanatics, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us. So feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, Hallowed Ground Part 3. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. As you've probably noticed by now, I'm typically a fairly anxious person. Living off the grid miles from town in an abandoned, haunted cemetery wasn't a decision I made lightly. I worried about everything that could possibly go wrong, even about quite a few things that couldn't actually go wrong. No matter how much I tried to talk myself out of it, I could not break my own resolve. I couldn't leave the cemetery and its secrets to rot. No matter the challenges or risks, I would make it my own. I wasn't foolhardy about it either. I did a lot of research and preparation. Before I was willing to fully commit by buying a camper trailer, I decided I needed to spend at least one full night in the cemetery. I needed to ensure I wouldn't be in any danger from the spirits that dwelt just on the other side of the weakened veil. Otherworldly things do tend to be more active at night. When the veil is a little weaker and mortals tend to be either sleepy or fearful, there had been a man squatting there for at least several weeks, but I was unsure what precautions, if any, he had taken to ensure his safety. The cemetery sits in the middle of a municipal forest called Hallowed Woods, a little under 10 miles past the city limits. It's around a mile wide by 4 miles long, with a country lane named Hallowed Mile Road slicing through the center. The cemetery is a 5-acre plot of land in the middle, just to the north of the lane. With the exception of the entry arch, the graveyard itself is almost entirely obscured by the tree line. The path leading into it is easy to overlook. Hallowed Mile isn't that heavily used, so even if it wasn't hexed, the cemetery is pretty inconspicuous. I couldn't find anything about a cemetery in Hallowed Woods online. I combed through records at the public library and town hall, and still came up empty. Ever since the man's ancestor made it hallowed ground, information about the cemetery and anything in it just faded from mortal memory. If I stayed long enough, I'd probably be forgotten too. I am at least pretty sure that the existence of the cemetery is perfectly natural. It makes sense that back in the days before motor vehicles, the local farming community would have wanted a closer graveyard than the one in town. My research wasn't entirely fruitless. Hallowed Woods has long held a reputation of being haunted. Over the past 2 centuries, there have been at least dozens of sightings and encounters with spirits and fairies. There's a legend about a horned green man that still protects the woods from development, a handful of other minor cryptids, even one account of the Hallowed Mile becoming an infinite loop during certain times, just to name a few. Aside from the will of the wisps, I had yet to experience any of these things during my time in the cemetery. There wasn't a lot of consistency between the various alleged encounters and folklore. Yet, I did manage to find multiple incidents of hikers wandering off the trails and experiencing missing time. That's exactly what would happen if a non-clairvoyant found the cemetery and there was no one else there. They'd just forget about it. Other than that, I was thoroughly unimpressed by the hodgepodge of urban legends and campfire stories. They seemingly had nothing to do with the Elderkin, wisps, or the Hadean underworld. At first, I thought I could dismiss them as apocryphal. But then it occurred to me that maybe creatures weirder than myself might be attracted to a hallowed cemetery as well. As unnerving as that thought was, I couldn't find a single confirmed instance of someone dying in the woods. There weren't supposed to be any large predators living in it either. There was even a small campground at the north end of the forest, which I remembered I had actually been to a few times as a teenager. So I decided it would be safe enough to spend the night. The cemetery was beautiful as always when I arrived. However, it was not as vibrant as it had been in October. Now the trees were all but bare. The leaves upon the ground had grown dull, and the atmosphere was overall more somber and subdued. There aren't many people aside from myself who'd consider naked trees and crumbling gravestones under a dark gray sky a cordial sight, but I'll take it over a crowded urban center in a heartbeat. I was also glad to see that the man's tent was still standing under the evergreen tree. I had never taken it down, and though I had only been in it once before, I deemed it suitable enough to spend at least one night in. I'd brought my own sleeping bag for hygienic reasons. I had arrived long before sunset and set to work sorting through the man's possessions. What little there was I handled as respectfully as I could. Anything fit for donation I would drop off at Goodwill. But I was somewhat taken aback to find that there wasn't a single item of food left. He really had only brought himself just enough to make it to Halloween. Aside from a meager allotment of clothes, blankets, hygiene supplies, and water testing strips, the only notable personal effect I came across was a russet brown leather wallet with a mandala embossed on the front. I opened it up and found no cash or cards, only a single pocket-sized photograph framed in the plastic window slot. In it, I saw the man standing with a slightly younger woman, holding what looked like a 2-year-old girl upon her knee. I could only assume they were his wife and daughter, and that the elder kin had likely caused their deaths just to torment him. After finding that, I had to take a moment and steady myself before I could continue. Once I bagged up all the man's old belongings and tossed them into the trunk of my car, I hauled out the fountain I'd brought to serve as a kind of donation font for the elder kin. The ancestors' journal had made it very clear that the elder kin must be shown respect and deference at all times to avoid offending them. Though I didn't realize it at the time, leaving spare change on the ancestors' grave had been a token sacrifice. It expressed my gratitude for them letting me use the cemetery. I figured that if I wanted to live there full time, I would need to show them a little bit more respect. And the fountain was a kind of down payment on that. I spent a few $100s on it, which I hoped would be a sufficient investment to ensure my well-being. It was fiberglass with a pewter finish, solar-powered with a large basin upon a 3-sided base. Each side had a relief depicting either the maiden, mother, or crone. Though I wasn't yet a practicing Wiccan, the ancestors' journal had alluded to Persephone being an avatar of the maiden goddess. So I thought the motif was appropriate. And if the spirits didn't like it, it would at least make a nice bird bath. Once it was filled up and running, I reverently gathered up all the coins along the grave and plunked them in, along with the spare change I had with me. I didn't know yet what I would do once it was filled up with coins, but that was a while away. While I was doing this, I noted that the purple rose I had first seen resting on the ancestor's grave all those weeks ago was still there, and it didn't appear to have wilted at all. Curiously, I picked it up to see if maybe it was plastic or some other artifice. A gentle prodding of its thorns seemed to indicate it was genuine, as did its still vibrant fragrance, as strong as if it had been freshly picked. Each time I had seen it before Halloween, I had just assumed it was a fresh, wild rose that the man picked from somewhere nearby. As weird as that was, he'd been dead for weeks at that point, so it obviously hadn't been replaced in at least that long. An undying rose in a graveyard, I smirked to myself. I brushed it off as having something to do with the ancestor and their magic. Maybe during my studies of their library, I'd learn more about it. I dug a small hole with my finger into the earth, still soft from when the man had exhumed the grave, and placed the stem so that it stood erect inside it. It still had leaves, and even an ordinary cut flower that still has leaves can be replanted. Since this rose was magic, I was fairly optimistic about its prospects. Once I'd finished my preparations for the night, I turned to my secondary purpose for the cemetery visit. I was here to hold a small memorial for the man who had once inhabited this space. To my knowledge, I was the only living soul who knew of and cared about his passing. It was a small token of respect I could offer. I leaned a memorial wreath against the ancestor's grave. Inside it, I nestled the photograph I'd found in the man's wallet. I collected 3 silver coins from the safe in the mausoleum. Without a body to place them on, I positioned them on the wreath. I hoped they could serve as a payment to the ferryman, even in this unconventional manner. As the sun began its descent, I lit a small candle inside a porcelain jack-o'-lantern holder. Kneeling by the grave, candle in my hands, I searched for the right words. I don't know if you can hear me where you are, I began. I'm still trying to grasp how all this works. It's all rather terrifying, to be completely honest. And since I'm being truthful, part of me is angry at you, blaming you for ruining my life. But even so, that part doesn't think you deserve to burn in hell forever. The time you've already spent there probably surpasses any sentence you truly deserved. But despite my ambivalence, I want to thank you for your actions, for leaving me the keys to the mausoleum, for indexing your ancestors' journal, all of it. Without your guidance, I would have been adrift in confusion. Now, I at least have a semblance of understanding, an inkling of what transpired. Despite the horrifying truth, I still believe that knowledge trumps ignorance. So regardless of what happens to me, or to my sanity, thank you for sharing your knowledge with me. How I wish I knew your name. How I wish I had shared mine with you. I'm sorry I never properly introduced myself. When we first met, caution seemed justified. But after that, despite your eccentricities, you became my friend. I want to say better late than never. But the truth is, I have no idea if that's the case. But just in case it is, my name is Samantha. Samantha Sumner. If you can hear me, know that I've appointed myself the caretaker of this cemetery. I've always loved this place. Its beauty, its peace. Barring that one incident, of course. It's sacred to the elder kin, a weak point in the veil, a storehouse of arcane knowledge. I can't let that be lost. I plan on spending as much time here as possible to guard it, to understand it. I can't predict whether this will work out, but I'm willing to try. The assets you left in the mausoleum won't go to waste. They'll be dedicated to maintaining this place, which I believe aligns with your wishes. I don't have a pressing need for money. I've always been an impoverished member of the bourgeoisie. When I was a child, my parents bought mutual funds for me, filled them with savings and inheritance until I turned 18. If need be, I could survive solely on those. What truly excites me, however, are the books. I plan on learning everything your ancestor knew about spirits and the other world, to refine my own clairvoyance into full-blown witchcraft. And, if I'm lucky, if we're both lucky, I might even find a way to help you. Maybe that's a pipe dream. You and your ancestors had access to those books for generations, yet you couldn't escape the deal with Persephone. Right now, I barely have a clue about what I could do, yet I am still determined to try. I believe that covers everything I wanted to share with you. Thank you for everything. Remember that I'm here to remember you, to care for the cemetery, and I'll keep an eye out for anything that might make your eternity a bit less tormenting. For now, I've left you some pennies for the ferryman, just in case the passage to hell has a toll. I also have some libations. It's a horse-stage cognac, a favorite of my father's. We used to drink it together on our visits. Cheers. I held up the bottle in a toast, took a sip, and then poured the rest on the ground for my friend. Once empty, I replaced the cap and propped the bottle against the grave. May these spirits lift your spirits, my friend. By the time I finished speaking, the sun had set, and it was barely past 5. With 5 or 6 hours to kill before sleep, I was left alone in the darkness. This is likely why people rarely camp out in late November. I brought a powerful flashlight for emergencies, but I didn't intend on wandering around the cemetery in the dark. Instead, I started a fire and settled into a canvas folding chair, planning not to move until bedtime. barring any natural calls. I passed the time reading, listening to downloaded music on my phone and enjoying my dinner. Quite often, I simply sat quietly, tuning into the world around me. A winter silence had already settled in, seductively soothing. Cold-blooded creatures had either perished, migrated, or hibernated, leaving only owls and coyotes to serenade the night. Naturally, I was still somewhat on edge from the Halloween experience and kept my senses attuned to any signs of spectral activity. Yet, I saw no ghosts or wisps, heard no ethereal voices. While the veil was slightly weaker than during the day, it was nowhere near as frail as it had been on All Hallows' Eve. As the hours ticked by, my anxiety waned, replaced by a complacency with my surroundings. I was no longer worried about otherworldly threats, and mundane threats seemed almost laughable. Trespassers were unlikely to be a concern either. It was highly probable that I was the only person around for miles. And even if I wasn't, the unique nature of the cemetery served as a shield against unwanted intruders. Ironically, the place that had initially incited so much anxiety in me now seemed to be the most tranquil refuge. I reveled in my solitude, tilting my head back to take in the rural night sky. The clouds had cleared, revealing a magnificent, unspoiled view of the cosmos. Countless stars sparkled brilliantly against the dark canvas of the night. I could even discern the Milky Way, a sight I hadn't witnessed in years. If I chose to live in the cemetery, I realized, I'd be able to behold this spectacle every clear night. This is going to be great, I smiled, reassured in my decision to make this my new home. When I finally retired to the tent for the night, I fell asleep surprisingly easily. Despite being fully dressed in outerwear and having only a thin layer of nylon as shelter, I was not perturbed. I've read that your brain never fully switches off during your first night in a strange location. But that night, I slept deeply. It was all the proof I needed to believe that even my subconscious saw the cemetery as home. My dreams, however, were not familiar. Every night, I've slept in my cemetery since. I have experienced vivid, mystic dreams. Dreams that I often struggle to interpret. I've come to realize that when I sleep, when my mind is quiet and devoid of earthly stimuli, it is more open to spiritual revelations from across the weakened veil. That first night, I dreamed of my cemetery when it was young. It was a bright summer day in a time long past. The graves were not only pristine, they still had names upon them. Names that, upon waking, I was unable to recall. I saw a figure standing in the entry arch, their body completely shrouded in an impenetrable black fog. No identifying feature was exposed. They stood right in the middle, with arms outstretched and their head craned towards the sky. They began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. Without changing their stance, they slowly marched forward. Behind them followed a procession of astral beings. They issued from the now hexed archway. Incorporeal, skeletal things, made of faint shadow and wrapped in thin cloaks of darkness. They bobbed along the ground as if gravity were a mere suggestion to them. All of them had bowed heads and bent backs. Each carried themselves with a trodden stance and hopeless grimace. All marched forward simply because they had long ago lost the will to resist. As the shadow wraith and its melancholy slaves advanced, day was turned to night and summer to winter. Life, light, and hope retreated from their path. The names on the headstones evaporated into the night, forever lost to the void. When the grim trope reached the opposite end of the cemetery, it was entirely cast in a dismal winter darkness. They stood before a second archway, identical to the first. When the shadow wraith stepped foot under it, it seemed that the ritual was complete. The slaves, released from their duty, collapsed to the ground. They wept and screamed and moaned as they disintegrated into dust. A ring of bright blue, deathly cold flames encircled the cemetery, forming a perimeter with the two archways as its terminals. Thunder cracked and a palpable darkness, deeper than any earthly night, enveloped the cemetery. It was pelted in a rain of black ichor from some cursed titan. I could feel everything slowly sinking away from the mortal plane and into the underworld. The shadow wraith moved towards the middle of the cemetery now to inspect its work. The cemetery would forever be of two worlds, with the front gate for mortals and the back gate for spirits. With both of them now at an equal distance from the wraith, the question remained, which world did it desire most? I awoke then in the early morning, well rested, but with the strange and unexpected dream still at the forefront of my mind. Had any of that really happened? Not necessarily literally, but was there any kernel of truth to it? There was one way to find out. I leaped out of the tent and raced to the far end of the cemetery, skidding to a stop before I reached the woods. I saw it. Just behind the tree line, there was a second archway. I hadn't seen it before because the foliage had been too thick, but now the naked trees left it plainly exposed. It seemed that the cemetery had originally been a bit longer, and that the tree line had encroached inwards over the centuries. I stood there dumbfounded for a moment. The revelation from my dream was clearly manifested in the waking world. I didn't doubt that it was a portal to the underworld. Even in those early days, my clairvoyance was keen enough to sense its ominous astral properties. I took slow, cautious strides towards it, fearful that Cerberus himself would come charging to keep me out. The archway looked so mundane, exactly like the one out front. But its intrinsic chthonic nature bore down on my soul like a freight train. The closer I got, the more I had to fight my instinct to recoil. When I was right in front of it, I tentatively raised my arm. "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," I muttered before shoving my arm through the archway. Nothing happened. It was a portal for spirits after all. The dream had been quite clear about that. I could walk under it, all I wanted, and nothing would happen as long as my soul was firmly bound to my body. If I ever wanted to use it, I'd have to be dead. Or, like the man's ancestor had, learn how to astral project. I was a little crestfallen at this new revelation, to be honest. I had proven to myself that I could spend the night in the cemetery with no ill effect, though not without effect entirely. I had learned more about the nature of the cemetery and discovered a means by which I may aid my hellbound friend. But the reality of the task was daunting. I ruled that nothing needed to be decided right away, and that I should go to the somber Starlight Roadhouse up the highway and get a hot breakfast. I didn't have much faith in myself at that moment. Even if I could learn to astral project, I doubted if I'd ever have the courage to make an Orphean trek to the underworld by myself. But I wouldn't have to. Just a few months later, I would meet Genevieve, a gifted witch, learned occultist, and the love of my life. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale, Hallowed Ground, Part 3 by the talented The Vesper's Bell. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness and that you'll carry a piece of the Fear File Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fear File Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, so don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night, and stay scared.